Hello, in this video I will be talking about who I think did it better. Bach, Mozart, or Beethoven. I will be judging based on these criteria. What famous pieces did they write? How many overall pieces did they write? The training they had and how well they were able to use it, which consists of what age did they start playing, what age did they start composing, where did they perform and was it a place of any value, the school or schools they attended, and how well did they play the instruments they composed for. I will structure this video by comparing each of the three composers based on one criteria at a time. Per criteria, one of the three composers will gain a point. At the end of the video, I will announce the final winner based on this system. Without further ado, let's get started. Firstly, let's talk about Bach. Some famous pieces that Bach has written are the Brandenburg Concertos, Ave Maria, the Goldberg Variations, Concerto for two violins in D minor, Toccata and Fugue in D minor, and the Well-Tempered Clavier. Overall, he's composed around 1,128, or at least that's what Google told me. Next, we will talk about Mozart. Mozart composed famous pieces such as Eine kleine Nachtmusik, The Magic Flute, Requiem, Turkish March, Fantasia No. 3, Symphony No. 41, Jupiter, and composed overall 600 to 800 pieces. And lastly, Beethoven produced famous pieces such as Moonlight Sonata, Pathétique, Archduke Trio in E-flat, Symphony No. 9, Violin Concerto, and String Quartet No. 13, Grosse Fugue. Overall, he composed around 722 pieces. Unfortunately for this criteria, I will have to go off of quantity versus quality, which is not ideal, but I'm not going to go through all of 1,128 of Bach's work, so I will give this point to Bach. For the next criteria, it is our longest criteria, which consists of these prompts, which are what age did they start playing, what age did they start composing, where did they perform, and was it a place of any value, and what school or schools did they attend. Starting off with Bach, he started playing at 10 years old, and he started composing at 23 years old. His first ever place he performed was St. Michael's Church in Ohrdruf, Germany. His brother performed there, and Bach learned how to read, write, copy, and perform music. Essentially, this was the birthplace of his music career. Moving on to Bach's early teen years, he worked in the chapel of Duke Johann Ernst III in Weimar for 7 months as a violinist. This wasn't considered a great thing at the time, since Duke Johann Ernst III was not a leader of much value in the grand scheme of Saxe-Weimar. However, this was the first person outside of his own family that he was working for or around. In 1703, Bach was invited to play the organ at the new church, also known as the Bach Church in Arnstadt. This was a much bigger step, as he was invited to play and gave the inaugural recital at the church. He became the organist at this church from 1703 to 1707. He took a break from playing for about 4 months and explored music in Lübeck to hear this guy play. He came back with more than organ in mind, introducing different and interesting variations in vocal ornamentations, which the church was not fond of and found quite strange. Then, Bach worked at the Blausius Church in Mühlhausen. From here, this was seemingly a huge peak in his career. Many people started recognizing him as a great composer, in fact, one of the greatest composers in Germany. Mostly his cantatas and choral pieces were performed here. Although he was quite successful in his musical endeavors, he was making a very low salary here in Mühlhausen due to the high cost of living, due to the quarter of the entire city being burned down, thus housing being more expensive. Bach then went to perform as a violinist and harpsichordist for the court of Duke of Saxe-Weimar. This didn't seem like much, but in 1714 he became the leader of the orchestra and the court organist, which is a pretty big deal. Then he became known as the greatest organist in Germany, and many people came to see him all over Germany, in fact, like all over Europe, pretty much. In Dresden, Bach was invited to compete with French organist Louis Marchand, but Marchand backed down, and instead Bach gave a very impressive solo performance. Then Bach was given the position of a Kapellmeister, or in English a music composer, in the court of Anhalt-Köthen, which was the highest rank one could have had in the Baroque era of music, and him mostly writing violin concertos and sonatas there. In Leipzig, Bach became a choir and director of music from 1723 to 1729. Also in Leipzig, Bach started performing less, got into organ building, and then became the permanent director of the Collegium Musicum from 1729 to 1740, and I am trying very hard not to address any controversies of this time. Anyways, Bach was invited to play on all of the city's organs as a mean of a royal procession in 1747 in Potsdam. And finally, Bach attended the St. Michael's School in Lüneburg for only 2 years from 1700 to 1702, which was very, very early in Bach's career when he was still pretty much a kid. Next, we have Mozart, who performed at the court of Prince Elector Maximilian III of Bavaria and Munich in 1762 as a only 6 years old child prodigy. From then, he also performed in the imperial courts in Vienna and Prague, also in 1762 as a child prodigy. From then, Mozart had a huge concert tour from 1762 to 1765, consisting of the courts of Munich, Mannheim, Paris, London, Dover, The Hague, Amsterdam, Utrecht, Mechelen. This was a huge deal for Mozart and his family, affecting them both positively and negatively because of the near-fatal illnesses they suffered due to travel at this time. From then, Mozart had another tour from 1769 to 1771 to Italy, where Mozart was exposed to great performers and composers such as these guys, and during his stay in Italy, he wrote some of his first operas such as these. Then, in 1773 to 1777, Mozart was employed as a Kapellmeister in the court of Salzburg, working on compositions of all sorts, including some minor operas. And then in 1777 to 1778, Mozart kind of had a burnout moment, and he left for Paris, didn't accept work, and then went into debt, and then performed once, which the piece was called A Minor Piano Sonata. Then, in some point after that, in Vienna, Mozart competed with another pianist named Muzio Clementi. In Vienna, also, many of his operas were being performed from 1786 to 1787, and then finally, Mozart's final performances occurred in 1791. Mozart didn't really attend school. I mean, he was pretty much a genius at birth, so I guess he didn't really have to, and he was busy performing and composing from such a young age anyways. Moving on to Beethoven, he started playing at around 7 years old and started composing at around 9 years old. In Cologne, 7-year-old Beethoven performed clavier concertos and trios, but his dad actually lied that he was 6 years old in the promotional posters to seem like he was more of a prodigy to compete with Mozart, who was actually 6 years old when he began performing as a child prodigy as well. In 1792, Beethoven was appointed a court organist, which was a pretty big deal since he was only 22 at the time, and then he studied very heavily from 1792 to 1802 under these guys, but most notably Joseph Haydn. Under these teachers, Beethoven learned to be very knowledgeable about counterpoint and violin in great detail. Going back to Joseph Haydn, Beethoven performed Piano Sonata Opus 2 and dedicated it to him in Vienna. Then Beethoven went to Prague, Czech Republic in 1796 and then back in 1798. Then Beethoven went to perform in the Lobkowicz Palace in Prague, Czech Republic, and he would go on to have an improvisation contest with Daniel Steibel, who was a piano virtuoso, also in the Lobkowicz Palace. Beethoven would then perform in Himmelpfortgasse, Austria, at the Johns Hall, and this is an important one to mention because Beethoven actually started to go completely deaf here. And then Beethoven in 1802 would announce that he is deaf to the public by saying, "Oh, all you people who think or say I am hostile to you, or that I'm stubborn, or that I hate mankind, you do not realize the wrong that you do to me. I am deaf." After this point, Beethoven would perform at the Theater an der Wien, fully deaf and playing all of the solo parts himself in the third piano concerto. Beethoven is offered the position of becoming the Kapellmeister in Kassel. He accepts the offer, but Prince Lobkowitz and Prince Kinsky agree to pay him for life to stay in Vienna. And finally, Beethoven actually had the most schooling compared to the other two composers, having attended 5 years at the Tirocinium, So from age 6 to 11. So still pretty early in his career, but still the most schooling overall. With that being said, I have to choose the winners for this round, but I'm actually not going to do that. I'm actually giving a point to each of them, only because they had such distinctly different lives, and even with that, they were all connected at some point. I mean, Mozart was actually friends with Bach's kid, and Beethoven and Mozart actually were kind of friends at one point, and so those are all things that I have to take into consideration. And that being said, all the places that they performed were obviously some form of value to their life at some point. So it's a little bit difficult to actually judge them based on these factors at the end of the day. But I definitely think they all deserve 1 point equally. Next, I will be talking about how well did they play the instruments that they composed for. First, I will talk about Bach. So, fun fact, Bach's favorite instrument was called the Lautenwerk, which was a mixture between a harpsichord and a lute. And surprisingly, he actually wasn't very highly proficient at playing the lute or the Lautenwerk, but he often played his lute pieces on the harpsichord. That being said, Bach played viola, violin, organ, harpsichord, clavichord, like pretty much everything very, very well, including singing, because he wrote many cantatas and stuff. So his singing was also very, very proficient. Moving on to Mozart, who played many instruments quite well, such as the piano and the harpsichord, along with others like the oboe, the bassoon, the harp, the clarinet, trumpet, the flute. From what I found, he actually liked the flute the least. I don't know if that means that he was bad at it, or if he just straight up didn't like it. I couldn't really find out that information. Also, Mozart wasn't really much of a singer, and even though he wrote many operas and cantatas, he was just kind of taught the basics of singing. Some sources say that he was a pretty good singer, but not many really say anything about his singing skills overall. And lastly, Beethoven. So he played piano, organ, and the harpsichord along with violin and the viola. He played guitar as well, but he was not classically trained in it, so who knows if he was really great at it. I haven't really found many sources proving that he was or wasn't, so that's up in the air. And Beethoven really did not sing. I couldn't find anything proving that he was much of a singer, but he did write one opera, albeit an opera that a lot of people like, so hey, I mean, that's something. So for this last and final round, I will be giving the point to Bach, mainly because he played pretty much the same instruments that they did, but he also was the best singer overall. In fact, he was known for having a very, very wide range, unlike that of Mozart or Beethoven. So I'm going to give this one to Bach. And actually, there is another round. The most important round. Who is the hottest of the three? I mean, Beethoven, duh. I mean, isn't it obvious? So basically, he wins, right? Of course, Beethoven. He's the winner. He's the winner now. Nah, I'm just kidding. No, of course it's Bach. But I think they're all very great composers, and I think overall, if you ever think that one is better than the other, I mean, that's your opinion, but I think they're all equally great composers overall. And I think Bach wins especially because he paved the way for both Mozart and Beethoven, and I think that is more commendable in some aspect. I mean, Mozart and Beethoven were both known for being child prodigies and being able to play from a really young age, and especially Mozart, who had such much experience touring around Europe from a very young age. So that is also to be put into consideration, since Bach didn't really do that, and neither did Beethoven as much. So those are all things to be considered, but Bach wins in the very end. With that being said, that brings this video to a close. I want everyone to go out of their way to listen to some of these composers' great music, especially since classical music seems to be dying along with the younger generation, and I think it's really important to listen to these kinds of pieces, especially since they're a big part of history and why we have music that exists today. Anyways, thanks for watching this video and listening to me talk like a nerd for about 15 minutes. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.